Where did ego come from? Well, before we talk about where ego came from, we have to first explain exactly what we mean by ego. The word ego is used quite freely and can mean slightly different things to different people. Some people use it to describe egotism or egoic behavior in someone, which might imply that it was sometimes there and sometimes not there. There are also slightly different meanings used in psychology and psychotherapy. What we mean when we use the term boils down to identity. In fact, sometimes it's called an egoic identity. This is the identity of the lower mind and brain. It is the human identity structure. It is the little separate self that the mind thinks itself to be because it doesn't know the reality of its own existence. It's a biological function of the mind, and it's there so that the person can communicate with the social group around them, and it acts like a lens through which the world can be viewed. It is the root cause of the current human condition, which is unfortunately dominated by suffering. So where did it come from? Now, if you're an experienced meditator, you'll probably be able to sit quietly in meditation and reach a state where there are no thoughts, or at least very little thoughts coming through your mind. In those moments, it's important to realize a very simple concept. There is no mind in those moments. Mind has completely disappeared. Yes, I know the brain is still there, but in your personal conscious experience, there is no mind. But you are still there. You are still there. This is the first step in realizing the true self, which is pure and peaceful awareness. So if you are still there, when there are no thoughts, no mind, then that must mean that your identity is not tied to your thoughts. But the thing is, when your thoughts come back, your little sense of self comes back as well. And you start listening to all the nonsense in the mind again. In other words, when your mind stream is flowing, you are your thoughts. And when there is no mind stream, you are not your thoughts. That means that the egoic identity of the mind is 100% tied to your thoughts. You can try this little experiment yourself and prove it to yourself. Now, going a little bit further, what you actually find is that the false identity is actually tied to language thoughts. For example, you can have visual thoughts and not feel like the identity is present. But as soon as you have words and sentences come through your mind, it feels like there's an identity present. What this means is the ego evolved about the same time as languages evolved in humans. If you think about it, it makes sense that humans need an identity structure as part of their evolution. As soon as animals started living in social groups, they started to need mechanisms to identify different members of the group. The key word here is identify. If we take some other species, let's try and analyze to see what level of identity they might have. Let's say insects that live in a hive system first, ants, termites, bees, that sort of thing. They live in a group, and you can definitely say they've evolved ways to identify different individuals, or at least different types of individuals. There are specialized roles, and they've even evolved to be different in their anatomy depending on their role. You can get a worker bee, a nurse bee, forager bees, or guard bees, all within the same colony. Now, that's very different to what we're talking about in humans, but it's still a separation of identity. Now, let's take a species that lives a mostly solitary life, like snakes. There is literally no need to identify them amongst themselves. They don't really have personalities. Now, I've kept snakes, so I can confirm that. Now, as we move into species that have high levels of interaction with others of the species, we start to see more and more distinctive personalities among individuals. Let's say rabbits and other small rodents. They often live in groups, but they don't have large differences in personalities. But as levels of intelligence get higher, which can be correlated with brain size, social animals start to develop more and more complex personalities. Let's take dogs and wolves, for example, or horses. Now we can see that there are definitely well-defined personalities in the group. This is so that they all find it easier to distinguish between each other, as well as using other methods like visual and olfactory cues. Now, as we move into the higher animals like chimpanzees and gorillas, for example, or dolphins, we start to see very complex personalities and even a sense of self. That is, a recognition of the mind of its own identity. That is basic self-awareness. Even some dogs have a basic recognition that they are a dog. The same can't be said for a rabbit or a mouse. So this sense of self, this self-awareness that starts to develop in higher animals is the false self, the mask identity, the little self, the psychological self, the egoic identity, the ego. It's a natural phase that the evolution of life has to go through before reaching the truth of its real identity. So in humans, as language evolved and humans started to communicate in much more complex ways, this supercharged the egoic identity, as all sorts of different personality types were needed as part of a functioning society. This accompanied the process of diversification of roles within a society. Now, you could say that the journey of life is all about growing levels of self-awareness. The rock has no self-awareness. The DNA molecule has no self-awareness. The amoeba has no self-awareness. The insect has no self-awareness. The small mammal, reptile or bird, has the seed of self-awareness. The larger mammals have a developing sense of self-awareness. The great apes have a well-developed sense of self-awareness. The human being has an overdeveloped sense of self-awareness. By the way, when we say that something doesn't have self-awareness, we mean self-awareness, not just awareness. Animals can have awareness, but no self-awareness. A mouse has awareness. It can feel pain or pleasure. But we would say that it has no self-awareness. It doesn't know that it's a mouse. So if you caught it, we just said that humans have an overdeveloped sense of self-awareness. Now, what do we mean by overdeveloped? Well, the human being has now what we call an ego. The ego firmly believes that its identity is the personality of the mind that is generated and sustained by the thinking mind. The ego worships the intellect and analytical thinking. The ego thinks that it is king. But the human species as a whole has not reached the highest level of self-awareness yet. It is mostly stuck at the egoic identity. But it is possible to progress to the highest form of self-awareness. In fact, the time is now. We graduate to the highest level of self-awareness when the universe itself realizes that it is awareness itself incarnated into human form. First, the person needs to become aware that its true identity is not this fundamentally flawed and limited and ever-changing personality that seems to cause itself endless suffering. The person realizes through meditation that its true nature is pure awareness, the awareness that lies just behind the mind, just waiting to be found. Next, the source of the universe within that person actually realizes that it is the awareness that we're talking about. It's like the universe wakes up from its slumber and realizes itself through you. Once the source has realized its own true self, it realizes that it is infinite, eternal, and forever peaceful. Now, this process can take a long time, but it's characterized by a migration of identity from the false self, or ego, to the true self, which is the silent inner peace of the awareness of the source of the universe. This is the end of suffering. This is the end of desire. This is the end of pain. This is the end of reincarnation. This is the end of karma. This is the start of a new journey. It's the start of deep peace. It's the start of true vision in all definitions of the word. This is self-realization, and it is the destiny of every soul on this planet.